In the turbulent years of World War II, as Allied and Axis forces clashed across Europe and North Africa, Italy's armoured spearhead lagged dangerously behind. The Italian army, constrained by limited industrial output and outdated doctrine, fielded its M1542 medium tanks, a design born from lessons hard learned in the blazing deserts of North Africa. The M1542, an urgent evolution of earlier models, provided only a stopgap answer, rolling onto the battlefield just in time to meet the storm of 1943. Yet, even as these tanks rumbled into service, Italian commanders knew a stronger, more modern vehicle was desperately needed. That answer lay in the Carro Armato P40, a tank that existed first as a promise, envisioned to stand alongside the mightiest Allied and German armour. Its development was long and fraught with delay, as Italy's factories raced against both time and the relentless advance of enemy forces. By the time the first P40s emerged from the assembly lines, the world around them had changed. Italy itself was fractured by armistice and occupation, and the future of its newest war machine was far from certain. The P40 project was complex, not only in its development and design, but with the added pressure from the Italian military for a better tank and a Fiat Ansaldo duopoly that was looking after its own interests. Military officials of the Regio Esercito and General Staff requested that Fiat Ansaldo work on a new design for a tank capable to fulfill the role of a breakthrough tank. The earlier M1139 medium tank failed miserably, and there were concerns about the M1340 tank even as it left the factory of Ansaldo. Italian manufacturing leading up to the war was not in favour of heavy tanks. The focus was to produce smaller, cheaper tanks. Centro Studi Motorizzazione, CSM, an organisation that oversaw the development and standards of Italian armour, prioritised the development of medium tanks. The focus had been on outdated designs. Up until 1939, when the M1139 entered service, the Regio Esercito had no medium tanks. The project for the P40 started in 1938. Documentation was signed for the development of a Carro Pesante, Carro P, a heavy tank. Initial requirements were, according to Mussolini's orders, for a 20 to 25 ton tank armed with a 47mm gun and 3 machine guns. It would have a crew of 6 to 8 and a top speed of 32 km per hour. Fuel capacity would be enough to drive for 10 hours. The design would not be new, but a thicker, armoured version of the M1340. It is well documented that Mussolini demanded a heavy tank to be built, but it is likely that there was pressure from Hitler for Italy to field a heavier tank and bolster weak Italian armoured divisions that had outdated formations. This pressure would continue later in the development of the P40. For about a year into the development, all work was done entirely on paper. Drawings were produced, ideas and concepts noted, but in 1939 changes to the initial requirements were made. Italian engineers were shown a Panzerkampfwagen Neubaufahrzeug. This German medium tank itself had become outdated, but it had an influence on the Italian tank designers. The tank featured a 75mm howitzer gun. The Carro P design would now resemble a mix of the Carro M and Neubaufahrzeug tanks. The design was developed around mid-1940. It would include a second, small turret with 2 machine guns and a 20mm Breda autocannon in the front hull. Thickness of the frontal armour would be 40mm, hardly a step up in protection from the 30mm of frontal armour on the M1340 tanks. It would have a 420 horsepower engine with a top speed of 32 km per hour. A second variant was designed a little later in 1940, and with it the tank would be renamed as the Carro P75. The Italian army were not impressed with the previous design, and they wanted more mobility. The requirements were for a top speed of 40 to 50 km per hour, the speed of a medium tank. The second small turret was removed from the reworked design. The mass was reduced to 25 tons, and the tank was shorter in length. The 20mm Breda autocannon was moved from the front hull position to the turret. The crew was reduced to 5. Although general staff and military officials were impressed by the design, it still didn't move forward to the prototype stage. By December 1940, it became clear that the Italian tanks of the Regio Esercito required more armour. A new set of requirements were submitted to Fiat Ansaldo. Another design was drawn. The new Carro P40 would weigh 23 to 25 tonnes, powered by a 330 horsepower engine. Top speed would reach 35 to 40 km per hour, making it faster than the M1340 tanks. Armour thickness was increased to 50mm at the front, with 40mm at the sides. Machine guns would be reduced to 2 in the hull. A coaxial machine gun would be added too. The tank still resembled the M1340. Italy's medium tanks still had an influence on the design of the Carro P40. During the design of the Carro P40, an alternative variant was prepared, and this had even more resemblance to the Carro Armato M1340. The mass would be at 23 tonnes, crew reduced further to 4. The engine would be the 330 horsepower Spartipo, although the German Maybach HL120 was considered as an alternative. The number of machine guns did not change, but again influenced by the M1340 design, it had twin machine guns in a dual ball mount in the front of the hull. This would be the variant that would finally make it to prototype stage, which was built around the summer of 1941. At this point the tank's name changed to the Carro Armato P40. This is the first prototype. You can see that the armour plates are quite flat, and the overall shape of the hull and turret resembles the M1340. The notable difference is the 75mm howitzer gun. It is around the summer of 1941 that a decision is made to increase the firepower of the tank, switching from the 75mm howitzer to a higher calibre 75-32 gun. This gun could supposedly combat heavy British tanks at close range. By now the tank design has a mass of 24 tonnes. Trials were carried out with the experimental tank, although only using the 75mm howitzer, as the 75-32 had not yet been received. The tank performed well in testing. In December 1941, the tanks received the 32 calibre gun to increase firepower, but there were to be further significant developments to the design. It is often documented that the Italian engineers working at Fiat Ansaldo got hold of several T-34 medium tanks for inspection. The stories vary on how they were able to inspect them. Here is the most popular story. The Germans, fighting the Soviets on the Eastern Front, managed to capture some of the T-34 tanks. While they took some of the tanks for their own review and inspection, they offered T-34s to the Italians on loan. Thus, Italian engineers were able to get a good look at the tank and see the distinctive sloped armour of the Soviet vehicle. More alterations were made to the Carro Armato P40 after trials were carried out with the T-34s. By this time we are into 1942. The Italians at this stage could not make any changes to the chassis. This would have further slowed down the development of the tank. Fiat Ansaldo were under pressure by this time. The Italian army needed a tank fast, and there was pressure from Hitler in Berlin. Licenses to build German tanks were offered to the Italians. This included the new Panther tank. The Panther was influenced by the T-34 and featured sloped armour. Fiat Ansaldo had to work quick to push back this competition to their designs and maintain promises to the Regio Esercito that the tank would be completed, producing a capable heavy tank. Along with the design for the P40, Fiat Ansaldo were able to put forward further designs, the P43 and P43 bis. The P43 was going to be a heavier tank with more armour in response to the anti-tank weaponry and field guns of the Allies. Fiat Ansaldo were successful in convincing General Staff to abandon the idea of producing German tanks for the Italian army. This is a 3D model of the P40 at its final production design. The The hull was significantly changed, the front and turret became sloped, the side of the structure featured sloped plates too, reminiscent of the T-34 Soviet tank. Not only was the turret sloped, it also became smaller and of a lower profile. The hull machine guns were removed. These were seen as a weakness to the frontal armour. This tank would be an assault tank, capable of leading the attack. Frontal armour had to be strong. This was a change from the Italian medium tanks that were an all-purpose tank, with the front ball-mounted machine guns providing infantry support when needed. The P40 now only featured 2 machine guns, one coaxial, the other could be used for anti-aircraft purpose. Another big addition came in the form of a larger caliber gun, the 75mm L34 cannon. A second prototype was built, and trials took place in July of 1942. The tank weighed in at 25 tons and could reach a top speed of 40 km per hour, powered by a 24-litre V12 Spar Tipo 342 diesel engine with 330 horsepower. Construction remained bolted like the other Italian tanks during World War II, a weakness to the armour protection. However, it must be pointed out that the British, the main adversary in North Africa at the time, also fielded tanks constructed using bolts and rivets. The tank was adopted into service on November the 25th, 1942. At some point, the designation of P2640, the common designation system for Italian tanks up until 1942, may have been used. To this day, the tank is commonly referred to as the P2640. However, military documentation states P40. Tank designation policy changed in 1942. The final production tank weighed 26 tons. Tank classifications of other nations during the time would designate the tank as a medium tank at that weight, but for the Italians this was a Carro Pesante and certainly heavier and more imposing than the previous series of medium tanks. Assessing the combat performance of the P40 tank is difficult. The Reggio Esercito never got to use the tank. P40 tanks, along with many armoured Italian vehicles, were seized during the time of the Italian armistice in 1943 under Operation Axe. The Germans also took control of the Italian factories of Fiat and Ansaldo, thus overseeing the continued production of Italian tanks and self-propelled guns. After the armistice, the P40 was primarily used for policing the north of Italy, still occupied by the Germans, assisted by a newly formed puppet state headed by Mussolini, Repubblica Sociale Italiana, the Italian Social Republic. The tank was designated as Panzerkampfwagen P40I. There is limited documentation and evidence of the tank's use, and it wasn't used for typical battlefield combat most of the time. There was an encounter between the British 6th Armoured Division, armed with Shermans, and the 24th Waffen Mountain Division of the SS Karstjäger that had 14 P40 tanks around the border of Austria. There is not much information or battle reports, but some sources claim P40 tanks were lost. I have read many forum posts and statements included in written pieces posted on blogs and military websites. They often claim that the Germans thought that the tank was inferior to their own. I doubt this. I think there was a lot of interest in this tank. Here is a picture of Hitler, along with many generals inspecting the P40 around a month after the Italian armistice. There must have been positive reports from the Germans based in Italy about this tank at the time to generate this much interest. It is also reported that the Army Group C, Heeresgruppe C of the Wehrmacht, initiated a schedule and timetable for the production of the tank. The tank must at the very least have been deemed a useful and capable tank. The only feature of the tank that the Germans were not happy with was the engine. The Germans wanted the Maybach HL-120 engine. It is likely that they had concerns about the Italian engine's reliability. When the Germans seized the P40s and the factory of Ansaldo building it, many were incomplete. Some tanks were waiting for an engine. There was a bottleneck at the factory, with the majority of work going into the M1542 and some Avente models like the 105-25. The Germans could have insisted on Fiat Ansaldo refocusing their efforts on building more Italian engines. However, there are sources that claim that an order was sent for the Maybach engines. The engines never materialised. Production plans continued for the P40, but some of the tanks would be built without an engine. The engineless tanks would be used as static fortifications for defensive purpose. They were used in defensive gun positions at the Battle of Anzio. Only around 60 P40s were built with an engine as a fully operational tank. Around 38 were built without an engine. These figures do differ depending on the source. The fact that these P40s never received an engine suggests that the Germans did not rate this tank highly enough to enforce the production of engines for these tanks. The Maybach engines that the Germans in Italy were waiting for were likely prioritised for German tanks. Another idea was suggested for the use of P40 turrets. Here is a photo of a turret removed from the P40 and positioned into the ground. The armament has been changed. We now have a howitzer gun installed. The L34 cannon has been removed. This idea never went past the testing stage. It is commonly reported that at least one of the P40 tanks was given to an armoured group fighting under the Italian Social Republic. This group was called the Gruppo Calazzato Leoncello. Again, the tank was not used significantly in combat, mainly used for anti-partisan duties. There is this photo showing the tank left abandoned during the collapse of the Social Republic in 1945. Without evidence of the P40 battling Allied tanks, it is difficult to gauge how good the tank was in combat, but we can take a look at the specifications of the P40 and compare with an M4 Sherman at the time, armed with the M3 75mm gun. A direct comparison between the Italian P40 tank and the mid-war M4 Sherman armed with the M3 75mm gun reveals that while both tanks serve a similar role on paper, the Sherman offered clear advantages in most key aspects by 1943. Both tanks mount 75mm guns, but the Sherman's M3 L40 is longer than the P40's L34 and generally has slightly better armour penetration. The Sherman's gun could penetrate about 75 to 80mm at 500 metres and 70 to 75mm at 1000 metres. Many Sherman websites giving information on penetration values do differ, so it could be that the penetration was higher for the M3 gun. The P40's L34 gun is somewhat inferior in muzzle velocity and penetration, estimated at about 70mm at 500 metres. I am making this comparison assuming the tanks are firing an armour-piercing round. The P40 had the armour-piercing high explosive shell, and the Sherman had the armour-piercing shell, and around 1943 the M3 gun would have available the armour-piercing capped ballistic cap shell too. Armour thickness is broadly similar for the hull of both tanks, around 50mm. The P40's turret front is 60mm, while the Sherman has up to 76mm on the turret front. In a hull-down position, the Sherman could have the advantage. Both tanks featured armour sloping, increasing effective thickness for frontal attacks. The Sherman weighed a few tons heavier, but the Sherman may have had slightly better power-to-weight ratio. I say maybe because sources differ and there were different M4 models using different engines. Top speeds are similar, though Sherman's benefited from better suspension and cross-country performance. The Sherman had a superior suspension system. The P40 still used the outdated leaf spring suspension, which was not great when the tank goes over rough terrain. The Sherman features the vertical volute spring suspension, a more stable suspension for rough terrain. The Sherman has a 5-man crew, commander, gunner, loader, driver and a co-driver who could also operate a machine gun, which allowed task specialisation and improved efficiency, especially in combat. The P40 was typically limited to a 4-man crew. The commander was also the gunner. This hampers tactical observations and giving the crew orders for cohesion, as the commander is distracted by gunner duties. The Sherman's interior layout and mechanical reliability were widely considered superior. The Sherman was mass-produced in the thousands with continuous improvements and logistical support. The P40 was produced in tiny numbers, around 100, and suffered from late introduction, mechanical issues with a lack of spare parts, and inconsistent quality. Sherman's benefited from better communications and optics. The crew, generally in terms of skill and training, probably on par with each other because the P40 would have mostly German crews who received better training than the Italian tank crews. The big question is, could the P40 compete with the Sherman? In a direct tank versus tank encounter, the P40 could theoretically damage a Sherman at typical combat ranges. The P40, while a step forward for Italian armour, was outclassed by the Sherman in firepower, protection, mobility, reliability, crew ergonomics, and the sheer numbers. It could not compete on equal terms with the Shermans of 1943 using the 75mm gun. That being said, the P40 could do considerable damage to a Sherman, whereas the previous Italian medium tanks would struggle. Tactically, the commander of the P40 could not use the tank as a breakthrough, not against Sherman tanks. Commanders would have to revert to a cautious attack, maintaining a medium range rather than advancing aggressively towards a company of Shermans. Imagine a battlefield where the roar of engines and the thunder of cannons decide the fate of empires. In this unforgiving theatre of war, the Italian Regio Esercito stood armed with machines that often fell short against better equipped foes. Yet, hidden in the shadows of history lies a ghostly titan, the P40 heavy tank. Had this steel colossus rolled off the production line sooner, its thick armour and powerful 75mm gun might have rewritten the brutal script of the North African campaign. Picture the desert sands stained with the dust of battle as the P40 clashed with Allied armour, turning the tide with sheer might and resilience. But fate was cruel, and the P40 arrived too late, a promise unfulfilled. With only a handful produced, its potential was swallowed by the tides of war, relegated to silence as the Regio Esercito's hopes faded beneath the desert sun. The P40 remains a haunting reminder, a symbol of what might have been, a monstrous force that could have stood unyielding against the storm, but was lost to time and circumstance. Its legacy is not one of victory, but of a war machine born too late to change the course of history.